of the things that we make and use, either every day or on special occasions, encode our beliefs or cultural values. Humans have always had this creative impulse to make things. We make shelter, we make tools, we make bodily adornment, and we make things of spiritual importance. As an archaeologist, my job is to determine how we should look at these things and how we can learn from ancestral ways of making, especially related to beliefs, politics, or values. In other words, how do we, as modern observers, learn from things that makers created long ago in the past in a very different cultural context from our own? Things that might seem unfamiliar at first can become more accessible as we look at them closely. We can now see, especially in the ancient Americas, more connectedness and shared concepts of wealth and power. My name's James Doyle, and I am the director of the Mattson Museum of Anthropology here at Penn State. I came to campus after having been a curator at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. I had always been, I think, curious about the past, but really not until the summer after my first year of college did I start truly looking closely at things, ancient things, created in a context far removed from my own. That summer, I went with a faculty member on a research project to Guatemala, and I got the opportunity to visit the UNESCO World Heritage Site of Tikal. I found myself suddenly standing in some of the most emblematic buildings of the ancient world, wondering why people built these here. And then I realized what I had learned in class was true. These buildings, the plazas, the causeways, encoded celestial meanings. All across the city, monuments and buildings memorialized the histories of real people, ancient Maya kings and queens. And you can think about that today. Think about Washington, D.C. It's a whole city oriented on the sun's movements. The wide plazas and avenues are full of monuments to our past political leaders or past military victories. And so seeing this strategy at a very different context for the first time at Tikal really inspired me to dive deeper into archaeology. Today, I want to take us on a tour with some iconic objects, and those objects, looking closely at them, will speak to ancestral indigenous American ways of thinking about landscapes, organizing communities, taking leadership, and conceptualizing the divine. I'm going to start at the ancient Mexican city of Teotihuacan. This is a massive city. It's about 8 square miles, maybe about half the size of Manhattan. At its peak around 500 CE, it probably held about 100,000 residents. Right in the downtown, residents built massive stone pyramids. They're actually punctuating a planned urban landscape that is unique in the Americas. This very controlled layout speaks to the social organization of the place, but many questions remained about who lived there. Mostly, who was in charge? These avenues are lined with palaces where noble families lived, perhaps those who were collectively governing the city. But suggesting a sort of thriving middle class of sorts, in every direction for miles are sprawling multifamily apartment compounds, again, unique in the Americas. We can think about that today. How do the residential structures we make and live in speak about us as a society? Long after Teotihuacan was abandoned, this was a primordial origin place for the descendant Mexica people and even descendant communities today. Actually, the name Teotihuacan means the place where humans met the gods. Those gods from Teotihuacan actually had their conceptual origins about a millennium before that, on what is now the Gulf Coast of Mexico among the Olmec people. There, artists depicted both humans and divine beings. Take this diminutive seated female. The sculpture's only about 3 inches tall. This was excavated at the site called La Venta and probably created between about 800 and 400 BC. La Venta is a site also, just like we saw at Teotihuacan, that has a downtown with a big pyramid. These are probably representing primordial mountains. This sculpture was part of an assemblage that may have been an offering or a funerary grouping, but it gives key insights into material values of the Olmec people. She's sculpted out of rare green jadeite. She's wearing a pectoral that's an inlay of hematite. She's painted with red cinnabar. This gives us key insights into this ancient system of how materials were valued at the time. For example, that blue-green jade, that stone, references the fresh, green, shining sprouts of corn, the staple crop. The artist here used conventions that could refer to divine beings, these oversized eyes, the downturned mouth, but she could also be a human being. You can see her ears are pierced. Perhaps there were once dangling ornaments there. But who is she? Is she a ruler, an epic heroine, a maize goddess, or an esteemed mother, a grandmother? Regardless of her specific or precise identity, the artist, by pulling these valuable long-distance materials together, are signaling the importance of the female leadership represented here. Let's take a look at another small-scale portrait of an individual. About this time, we know a little bit more. This is coming from the north coast of Peru at the site of Sipan, which was part of the Moche culture. There, an individual known as the Lord of Sipan died between about 640 and 680 CE. His descendants interred him in one of the richest burials ever excavated by archaeologists. There were offerings of shell and gold and copper and turquoise and ceramics, and even sacrificed humans and animals. The assemblage included a very remarkable set of ear ornaments. This is the ear frontal that was attached to a bar like today's gauges. The entire circle is only 3 3/4 inches in diameter. These impressive ear ornaments were meticulously put together with hammered gold and mosaic tesserae of turquoise. What we're looking at is a 3-dimensional warrior flanked by 2 attendant warriors in profile. This is actually a meta representation of the Lord of Sipan himself. The regalia worn by this mini gold warrior mirrors the full-size set that the Lord was wearing in his tomb. This is a brilliant small-scale claim to many types of power. We have martial power. He's holding a war club and a shield. We have economic power over these long-distance traded resources like gold and turquoise, and then power over other people, like the attendants pictured on the ear spool or buried in the tomb. In Moche society, this is one of the examples of how artists and makers really underscored the claims that royal people were making with what they wore. Now, gold and turquoise, we can imagine, is valuable across cultures and across times. But in certain times, in certain places, perhaps other materials were more highly valued. Take the case of the Inca emperor, for example, for whom his clothing possibly represents some of the most expensive and intricate textiles ever produced. This is a tunic known as unku in Quechua, and it's made of a very special luxury cloth called kumbi, and all of the square tiles you see on the surface of this tunic are known as tocapus. This type of garment was reserved only for the highest echelon of imperial authority in the Inca Empire. It was possibly woven around the year 1532 out of natural cotton as well as dyed alpaca wool. It may have actually been made for the Inca Emperor Atahualpa, who died in 1532, but this may have been unfinished before he took possession of the garment. Recent research on this tunic suggests that this was a statement by the Inca Emperor that he was the ultimate authority. The most common motif among the tukapus you see is a miniature version of what we'd call a checkerboard tunic. The full-size tunics were reportedly used by the Inca's personal squadron of bodyguards, like his secret service. And so the suggestion of putting all of these military garments in a small scale on the tunic is that the Inca is wearing his supervisory military authority and projecting that to all of the beholders. This is a wonderful example of how political might was conveyed by fashion, by these amazing garments that the Incas commissioned from noble women to weave, rather than carving text in stone or writing them in books. Now, sometimes symbols of power were not sculpted or worn, but they could actually be consumed. Think about imported wines or delicacies that come from far away today. A good example of this comes from what is now New Mexico, at a site called Pueblo Bonito. This is beautiful town in Spanish. And it's within Chaco Canyon and was occupied between about the 9th and 12th centuries CE by successive generations of ancestral Puebloan people. There, archaeologists uncovered a unique deposit of 111 drinking vessels. This place, Pueblo Bonito, was clearly a very spiritual gathering place. This was a venue for ceremonies and feasting. The potter who made this built it by hand, so not using a wheel, and decorated the surface with aesthetic strategies like geometric abstraction to create a very striking visual experience when viewing these vessels. We know that they were actually used in a big celebration before their ceremonial deposition. On some of the broken pottery from this deposit, they detected the residue, the chemical signature of theobromine. That's the active ingredient in cacao. So the Pueblo Bonito residents were drinking chocolate, which is produced far away in Mexico or Guatemala, but they were obtaining this perishable material by long-distance exchange. This is a great example of this connectedness that is now much more visible because of contemporary scientific techniques than was in the past. These objects tell stories about a parallel history of art and architecture to what we are perhaps more familiar with from Europe or Africa or Asia. But the indigenous ways of making and representing did not end with the colonization after the Spanish invasion. In fact, people would be put to service for new artistic goals, or in fact use ancestral ways of creating as resistance to colonial regimes. I want to close today with an object that blends ancient material meanings with modern spiritual imagery. This was created by an artist that we know by name, Juan Bautista Quiris. He lived in Michoacan, Mexico in the 16th century. What we're looking at is a portrait of the Virgin Mary, based on European prints. She's staring down, tears are streaming from her eyes, and she's surrounded by these 4 cherubs. This is no ordinary devotional painting of Mary, however. The entire composition is created out of a micromosaic of cut and glued feathers. These are coming from hummingbirds, herons, parrots, even starlings. This is the creation of what is known as the amanteca. These are the feather workers. This was the highest rank of artist among the Mexica Empire. And these feather workers were put in service of the Spanish invaders to create new divine images with their skill. All of these buildings and objects can be considered instruments of seeing, teaching us to look at this parallel story differently. And these things that could be seemingly hidden or remote within these ancient objects may not be that far away from something we can understand today. So I want to challenge you next time you're going to a museum or you're in a store, or even if you're in a relative or a friend's house, take a second and look really closely at something. Just pick an object and think, what stories can that object tell about who made it or who cares for it today? Thank you.